Hi! The next episode of Battlebots is coming up on Thursday, and I decided to tell you which robots I think are going to win. Let's start with the fight between Manta and Scorpios. Who do I think can win that fight? Well, first, let's take a second to discuss exactly what kind of robot you would need to beat Manta, and see if Scorpios fits that category. Manta is a drum spinner, and typically against a drum spinner, what you want is a big strong wedge to deflect the blows from that weapon. However, against Manta, that wouldn't work. That's because Manta has two forks on the front of their robot that can get in underneath basically any wedge. We saw this in the fight between Stinkeye and Manta, where Stinkeye's wedge was probably good enough to deflect Manta's weapon, but unfortunately, Manta's forks just got right underneath that wedge and bent it upwards, making it impossible for Stinkeye to attack Manta because they couldn't get underneath it.
Oh, he chews up a wheel!
However, Manta is an extremely wide robot. Now this can be an advantage. Being so wide makes it pretty much impossible for robots to get around the side of Manta, but it also means it's impossible for Manta to miss its opponents if it drives at them to attack them. However, I think we can use the width of that robot against it. You see, because Manta is so wide, that means those two forks are relatively far apart. So if your wedge was narrow enough, it could simply pass between those two forks and get straight at the drum. Essentially, here's what you need to defeat Manta. You need a wedge that is both narrow enough to pass between the gap between Manta's forks and tough enough to deflect Manta's weapon. So, does Scorpios fit that category? Well, as to the requirement of tough enough to deflect Manta's weapon, the answer is we'll wait and see. If it isn't tough enough to deflect Manta's weapon, then, well, it doesn't have a chance. But if it is tough enough, how do we think Scorpios is going to fare? Scorpios' wedge does look like it is just about narrow enough to pass through the gap between Manta's forks. And if it does manage to pass between Manta's forks and deflect its weapon, then it might have a chance of holding its own against Manta for a bit, but even then, I still can't see Scorpios beating Manta, unfortunately. Because while Scorpios' wedge is narrow enough to get between Manta's forks, I don't think it's narrow enough to do that consistently. Yes, if Manta and Scorpios go directly head-on, Scorpios might get between those forks, but if Manta comes at Scorpios around the side, or at the front but at a slight angle, Manta's forks will get underneath Scorpios and probably throw him high into the sky. And I think once Manta gets even one good hit on Scorpios, it's over, to be honest. I have watched all 18 of the battles that Manta has had which have been released to the public, and I can tell you that they are relentless. They are constantly on the attack, driving fast towards their opponent. So once they get even a single decent hit on Scorpios, well, they're just going to press their advantage and never give Scorpios a chance to recover. For example, if they can flip Scorpios over, Scorpios will need a second or two to right themselves and drive back into a position where they can fight Manta, and in that time, Manta can just hit them again and flip them back over. So that's what I think is going to happen when Manta and Scorpios fight each other. Scorpios, if it's lucky, might be on top of the battle near the beginning if it can withstand that weapon on the front and pass between those forks, but once Manta attacks Scorpios from a slight angle or around the side, they are going to get a good hit, and once they get even a single good hit on Scorpios, they're going to be on top of the fight from that moment on. Manta is going to win.
But Ben, if there is any chance at all that Scorpios beats Manta, how do you think they can do it?
In the unlikely event that Scorpios does beat Manta, how do I think it's going to happen? Well, first off, I'm going to say that I don't think Scorpios can beat Manta by knockout. I think if they win, it's going to be by judge's decision. The reason I think this is because Manta is honestly just too well armoured, I think, for Scorpios to immobilise them. That drum, for example, is a 70-pound lump of metal. Even if it stops working, it's still a pretty tough piece of armour, and I'm sorry, but I've seen Scorpios fight, it's a good robot, it's a very damaging robot, I just don't think it's good enough to immobilise Manta. So if Scorpios does beat Manta on a judge's decision, how is it going to happen? Well, other than the fact that the forks are pretty far apart, Manta does have one other glaring weakness, and that is the fact that once you flip it upside down, it becomes less dangerous. In the fight between Hexadecimator and Manta, the only fight which Manta ever lost, Hexadecimator flips Manta upside down right at the beginning of the fight, which is exactly what they needed to do to beat them, by the way. Once you flip Manta over, its forks are off the ground so it can't get under you. Furthermore, that drum is spinning downwards rather than upwards, which makes it less damaging. Manta also usually runs on 4-wheel drive, but once you flip it over, only 2 of those drive wheels are left on the ground. This presumably means they have less pushing power once you flip them over, and also the controls are reversed for the driver. So essentially, once you flip them over, Manta is a much, much less dangerous machine. So I think if Scorpios can find a way to flip Manta over near the beginning of the fight, they might be able to win it on a judge's decision. And of course, if Scorpios manages to disable and or seriously damage Manta's weapon near the beginning of the fight, they might also win it on judge's decision. But other than that, I don't know if it's possible for Scorpios to win. So in conclusion, here are my predictions for the fight between Scorpios and Manta. So now we move on to the fight between Copperhead and Jackpot. I think if Jackpot plays their cards correctly, they could win this fight. The reason being is because Copperhead's biggest weakness is the same as Manta's biggest weakness. When Copperhead gets flipped over, those forks are off the ground, the drum is spinning the wrong way, and the controls are reversed for the driver. And as luck would have it, Jackpot has a lifter on the front of their robot. So what they need to do is lift Copperhead over and invert the robot. Once they've done that, they can either push them towards the edge of the arena wall and lift them out of the arena, or, and much more likely, they'll just try and hit him with a spinner. Those big exposed wheels look like they'd be an easy target. Jackpot, for some reason though, very rarely even uses their lifter other than to self-right. Typically what they do is they go into the fight with their lifter raised up in the air, I assume to prevent it from getting damaged, but what's the point in having a lifter if you're not going to use it? Like, even against robots that it would be, in my opinion, logical to use the lifter against, they don't use it for some reason. I think if they did use the lifter, they could flip Copperhead over and probably win the fight, but I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to go in with the lifter raised, like they always do, and try and take Copperhead weapon on weapon. And if they do go weapon on weapon with Copperhead, I think Copperhead wins. Jackpot looks like it has a much higher centre of gravity than Copperhead, so it's a lot more unstable. And furthermore, Copperhead's weapon takes up a much larger portion of their robot's surface area than Jackpot's does. And this means that it is much more likely that Copperhead is going to get a hit on Jackpot's armour rather than their weapon, than for Jackpot to get a hit on Copperhead's armour rather than their weapon. So yeah, I'm pretty confident that Copperhead's going to win this fight, but if Jackpot does win, it'll be because they flipped Copperhead over. So next up we have Tombstone versus Mad Catter. I'm actually quite impressed with Tombstone's design because they've made sure to take full advantage of the main benefit of having a horizontal spinner, rather than, say, a drum spinner. So let me give you an example. In 2016, Carbide and Thor fought each other, and Thor's axe couldn't hit further than, say, a couple of inches in front of the robot, but Carbide's horizontal spinner, because it had a much, much longer range, it was a horizontal spinner, could hit things quite far out in front of the robot. And so, every time Thor moved in to attack Carbide, they would never ever reach the main body of Carbide to get a hit on it, because Carbide would simply knock them out of the way well before they even reached them. And that's the main benefit of a horizontal spinner. If the weapon is big enough, then it effectively forms an unbreakable force field around the front of their robot that prevents anybody from actually attacking the body of the robot. They can only come into contact with the weapon. And Tombstone has taken this advantage to an extreme. They've made their weapon as wide as possible with the largest range possible, specifically so it's pretty much impossible for them to miss their opponent. And even if the opponent does avoid that weapon and get around the side of them, it probably isn't going to help them much. A few years ago, Mad Catter and Tombstone fought each other in a world championship, and Mad Catter tried to drive around the side of Tombstone, but because Tombstone had such a wide diameter on its weapon, they could very easily get Mad Catter around the side first.
Mad Catter's got to be careful with those wheels on the back side of that buttress. Whoa! Huge.
By comparison, drum spinners, for instance, don't usually reach that far out in front of their robot, so typically, in order to attack your opponent, you have to get right up close to them so that they can potentially be close enough to hit you. That's not me saying that horizontal spinners are inherently better than drum spinners before. As we discussed earlier, there are still advantages to having a drum over a horizontal. For example, drum spinners, if you have forks on the front, can be an amazing counter to wedges, because they can simply bend the wedge upwards and stop them from attacking you. Whereas with horizontals, on the other hand, even if you do put forks on it, are still quite vulnerable to robots with wedges on the front. And that is exactly what Mad Catter has. Mad Catter has got a very low-angled, seemingly very tough wedge on 3 sides of their robot, which is just perfect for deflecting Tombstone's weapon. And this is a big improvement. In that World Championship fight, Mad Catter only had a wedge on the front. Now, they're protected from 3 sides. So here are our competitors. we have Tombstone, who probably doesn't have as good armor as Mad Catter, but their massive weapon means it'll be very difficult for Mad Catter to actually get a hit on anywhere but the weapon. With Mad Catter, on the other hand, they are much better protected against Tombstone's weapon, but they also have to be, because Tombstone will get a lot more hits on their armor than they will get on Tombstone's. Based on this, who do I think is going to win this fight? Personally, I'm going to go for Mad Catter. The reason I think this is because Mad Catter is a vertical spinner, while Tombstone is a horizontal spinner. Horizontals are generally less effective than verticals. So in conclusion, my predictions for who's going to win are Manta, Copperhead, and Mad Catter. But who I actually want to win are Scorpios, Blackjack, and Mad Catter. Okay, bye.